The worst part about falling in love with your former bully isn't the memories. It's waking up in his arms and realizing you don't remember how you got there. I opened my eyes to the pale morning light spilling through the hotel curtains, and for one impossible second, everything felt peaceful. The mattress was warm beneath me, the room quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner, and someone's steady heartbeat echoed close enough that I could almost mistake it for my own. Then reality hit. An arm rested loosely across my waist. I looked down, my breath catching as I recognized the familiar silver watch around the wrist. Ethan Walker, my boyfriend, my former bully, the same guy who had once made every Monday morning in high school feel like a punishment somehow, looked completely at peace sleeping beside me. His blonde hair was slightly messy, a rare sight for someone who normally looked like he belonged on the cover of a business magazine. I carefully lifted his arm, trying not to wake him, but the movement earned me a sleepy smile instead. "Morning," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. "You're staring." "I'm trying to figure out why we're sharing a bed," I whispered. Ethan blinked once, then slowly pushed himself upright. "You really don't remember?" I searched my mind, but the night before was a blur filled with music, laughter, and a reunion I had promised myself I would never attend. The last clear memory I had was checking into the hotel where our 10-year high school reunion was being held. After that, nothing fit together. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, looking strangely uncertain. That alone was enough to unsettle me. Confidence had always followed him like a shadow. Seeing hesitation on his face felt as unnatural as snow in July. "You insisted it would be less awkward if we acted like everything was normal," he said. "Then the front desk apologized because they accidentally gave away our second room." I frowned. "So they only had one left." "One room," he confirmed. "One bed." I let out a slow sigh and leaned back against the headboard. Of course, if there was one thing the universe seemed to enjoy, it was trapping Ethan and me in situations neither of us could escape. 5 years together had somehow erased none of the awkwardness created by 4 miserable years before that. Loving someone didn't automatically rewrite every painful memory attached to their name. Outside our window, the mountains stretched beneath a cloudless sky, calm and beautiful in a way my thoughts refused to be. Ethan quietly stood and walked toward the coffee maker without another word, giving me the space he had learned I sometimes needed. That simple gesture should have comforted me. Instead, it made me wonder when he had become so careful with my feelings. The boy who once laughed while my classmates laughed with him would never have noticed silence like this. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A notification from the reunion committee flashed across the screen. "Welcome back, class of 2016. Today's activities begin at 9 a.m. Don't forget to visit the memory hall." I stared at those last 2 words longer than I should have. Memory hall. Somehow I already knew the memories waiting there weren't the ones anyone had framed on the walls. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt longer than it should have, mostly because neither of us knew what to say. Ethan stood beside me with both hands tucked into the pockets of his navy jacket, staring at the glowing floor numbers while soft instrumental music drifted through the speakers above us. Years ago, silence between us had always meant another cruel joke was coming. Now it felt like 2 people carefully avoiding the wrong words because they actually mattered. I hated that I could tell the difference. The reunion registration desk buzzed with familiar faces and unfamiliar lives. Name tags, coffee cups, and polite laughter filled the ballroom entrance as people hugged classmates they had not seen in a decade. I recognized almost everyone, yet somehow felt like I belonged less than anybody else. Ethan reached for 2 name badges before I could. He handed mine over without looking at it. "Still allergic to small talk?" he asked with a faint smile. "Still pretending you enjoy it?" I answered. For the first time that morning, he laughed. It was quiet, genuine, and completely different from the loud, confident laugh that used to echo through crowded school hallways. Before either of us could say another word, the event coordinator clapped her hands for everyone's attention. "Welcome back, class of 2016, she announced. "We are starting with the memory hall before lunch, so take your time and enjoy the exhibits." My stomach tightened. We followed the crowd into a long gallery lined with photographs, yearbooks, trophies, and handwritten notes collected from former students. Every few feet, another memory waited behind polished glass. Soccer championships, theater productions, science fairs, smiling faces frozen in moments that looked happier than I remembered living through them. Then I saw it. A photograph from sophomore year. I stood near the back of the debate club group picture, shoulders tense, forcing a smile that fooled nobody who had actually known me. Ethan stood 3 rows away, taller than everyone else, wearing the confident grin I used to resent. I almost walked past until I noticed something strange. Someone had written on the photo border in faded black marker, "You deserved better than we gave you." There was no signature, just those 7 words. That was not there before, Ethan said quietly beside me. I turned toward him. His expression had changed completely. The color had drained from his face as though he recognized the handwriting. "Do you know who wrote it?" I asked. He hesitated long enough to answer the question without speaking. "Maybe," he admitted. Before I could press him further, another classmate called Ethan's name from across the room. A broad-shouldered man with an easy smile walked over and wrapped him in a quick hug. "Walker, it has been forever." Ethan greeted him politely, but the man's attention shifted toward me almost immediately. "You must be Noah," he said. "I always hoped you two would figure things out." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" The man frowned, suddenly looking embarrassed. "Wait, Ethan never told you." The room around me seemed to fade beneath the chatter of old classmates as Ethan quietly closed his eyes, looking like a man who had just realized the truth he had spent 10 years protecting was about to find its own voice. The question hung in the air long after the conversation around us faded into meaningless noise. Ethan never answered. Instead, he thanked the classmate with a tight smile and gently guided me toward the hallway outside the gallery. The cheerful chatter behind us disappeared as the heavy wooden doors closed. We stood beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the lake, where sunlight shimmered across the water with an almost irritating sense of peace. I folded my arms and waited. Ethan had promised me years ago that our relationship would never depend on secrets again. Right now, it felt like that promise was slipping through his fingers. "Talk to me," I said quietly. He stared at the mountains for several seconds before speaking. "Do you remember Ryan Mitchell?" The name landed harder than I expected. Ryan had been captain of the football team during our sophomore year. Popular, loud, the kind of person everyone wanted to impress. I nodded slowly. "He was the one who actually started most of it," Ethan admitted. "The jokes, the rumors, the stupid games." I frowned. "You were standing right beside him." "I know." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "And that is something I regret every single day." I searched his face, looking for the confidence that usually lived behind those blue eyes. It was gone. In its place stood someone carrying a weight that had clearly grown heavier with time instead of lighter. "You could have walked away," I said. "I could have," he answered immediately. "But I was 16 years old and terrified of becoming the next target." His honesty caught me off guard. It was not an excuse. It sounded more like a confession he had repeated to himself 1,000 times. "That does not erase what happened," I replied. "I know. It does not erase what I felt." "I know. Then why stay with me?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Ethan finally looked at me. "Because the person standing here is not asking for forgiveness from the boy I hurt. He is trying every day to deserve the trust of the man I love." My chest tightened in a way I could not explain. Loving Ethan had never erased the past. It had simply complicated it until every memory carried 2 versions of him. The teenager who laughed when I wanted to disappear. The man who now remembered exactly how I took my coffee and always left the last blueberry pancake because he knew it was my favorite. Which one was real? Maybe both. A volunteer interrupted us with an apologetic smile. "The next activity is starting in the old auditorium," she said. "Everyone is sharing anonymous memories from high school." Ethan glanced toward me. "We do not have to go." Normally, I would have agreed without hesitation. Instead, something inside me wanted answers more than comfort. "No," I said after a long breath. "Let us hear what people remember." The auditorium looked almost unchanged except for newer seats and brighter lighting. One by one, former classmates walked onto the stage to read anonymous notes collected before the reunion. Some were funny. Some were embarrassing. Some thanked teachers who had changed their lives. Then the host unfolded another card. His smile slowly disappeared as he read the first sentence to himself. He cleared his throat before speaking into the microphone. "To the quiet boy who spent every lunch alone, I am sorry we mistook your silence for weakness." My heart stopped. Ethan slowly reached for my hand beneath the armrest. I did not pull away, but I also did not hold on. Then the host read the final line, especially the one person who should have defended you but was too afraid to stand beside you. The words echoed through the auditorium long after the host stepped away from the microphone. Nobody clapped. Nobody laughed. For several quiet seconds, all that existed was the faint hum of the ceiling lights and the uncomfortable truth settling over dozens of former classmates. I could still feel Ethan's hand resting near mine on the armrest. He had not tried to squeeze it or ask for reassurance. He simply left it there, close enough for me to know he was present and far enough away to let me decide whether to cross the distance. When the session finally ended, people drifted toward the lobby in thoughtful silence. A few stopped to thank the organizers. Others quietly wiped tears from their eyes before pretending nothing had happened. I remained seated until the room had almost emptied. Ethan stood without saying a word and waited beside the aisle. He had learned that rushing me only made me retreat further into myself. "I need some air," I said. "I will come with you if you want," he answered. "Or I will wait here if you would rather be alone." That simple choice somehow felt heavier than any apology he had ever given me. We walked outside together, following a stone path that curved around the lake behind the hotel. Pine trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, carrying the fresh scent of cedar and cool mountain air. It should have been relaxing, but my mind refused to leave the auditorium. "Did you write that letter?" I finally asked. Ethan stopped walking. His shoulders rose with a slow breath before he nodded once. "About 3 months ago," he admitted, when the reunion committee asked everyone to submit anonymous memories. "Why anonymous?" "Because I was afraid you would never read it if you saw my name." I stared across the water, watching small ripples spread from a pair of ducks gliding across the surface. "You have spent years apologizing," I said quietly. "Sometimes I wonder if you are still apologizing for me or for yourself." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked worn around the edges. "I have carried this for almost 10 years, he said. "I never had the courage to give it to you." He placed it gently on the wooden bench beside us instead of handing it directly to me. It was an old notebook page, folded so many times that the creases looked ready to disappear. My name was written neatly across the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. "You wrote this in high school?" I asked. "The week before graduation." I picked it up, but hesitated before opening it. Somehow the unopened letter felt safer than whatever truth waited inside. "Read it whenever you are ready," Ethan said softly. "Or never. That choice belongs to you." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a message from the reunion coordinator reminding everyone about the evening welcome dinner. Attached was a seating chart. I opened the file absent-mindedly, only to freeze when I saw our names printed side by side at the same table. Below that was another note explaining that because of unexpected room shortages, all current couples attending the weekend would remain assigned to their original shared accommodations. I looked up at Ethan, then back at the folded letter in my hands. By tomorrow morning, I would know what he had written 10 years ago. I was no longer sure which frightened me more, reading the letter or realizing that part of me already wanted to believe every word inside it. The folded letter stayed in my jacket pocket through dinner like it had its own heartbeat. Every few minutes, I caught myself touching the edge of the paper just to make sure it was still there, as though losing it would somehow erase the chance to understand a decade of unanswered questions. The ballroom looked warmer that evening than it had that morning. Strings of golden lights reflected across polished windows, soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers, and conversations rose and fell like waves. It should have felt festive. Instead, every smile around me reminded me how strange memory could be. Some people remembered championships. Some remembered first kisses. I remembered counting the minutes until the last school bell rang. Ethan pulled out my chair before taking his own seat beside me. The gesture was quiet and natural, something he had done so many times over the last 5 years that I rarely noticed anymore. Tonight, I noticed everything. Across the table sat Melissa Grant, one of the few classmates who had always been kind to everyone. She smiled gently after studying both of us for a moment. "I have wanted to ask you something for years," she said carefully. I exchanged a quick glance with Ethan before nodding. "Go ahead." Melissa looked almost relieved. "When did you two actually start talking again?" I laughed softly because the answer sounded unbelievable even to me. 3 years after graduation. Completely by accident. Ethan smiled at the memory. We both reached for the same history book in a bookstore. Melissa blinked. That is the most ordinary romantic beginning I have ever heard. Nothing romantic happened that day, I replied. I almost walked away. Ethan chuckled. He did walk away. Because I thought you were following me. I was following you, Ethan admitted with an embarrassed grin. Only because I wanted to apologize. Melissa rested her chin on one hand. You never told him? Ethan shook his head. Not that day. She sighed. You have always made things harder than they needed to be. The conversation shifted as other classmates joined in, but Melissa's words lingered with me. Harder than they needed to be. That described almost everything about us. After dinner, guests wandered onto the terrace overlooking the lake where lanterns floated gently across the water. I slipped away from the crowd and finally unfolded the letter beneath one of the quiet wooden gazebos. The paper smelled faintly of old books and cedar, preserved by years inside a wallet. Dear Noah, if you are reading this, then somehow I became braver than I was today. I stopped after the first sentence because my vision blurred unexpectedly. I blinked several times before continuing. I was the coward who laughed because I thought silence would protect me. It never did. Every joke I repeated about you made me dislike myself a little more. You deserved one person to stand beside you, and I failed. I cannot change who I was. But if life ever gives me another chance to know you, I promise I will spend it being the person I should have been from the beginning. My hands trembled slightly as I lowered the page. Footsteps approached across the wooden deck, slow enough that I recognized them before I looked up. Ethan stopped several feet away, giving me room to breathe. Neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked the only question that mattered. Do you think the boy who wrote that letter still deserves a chance to become the man standing in front of you? For a long moment I could not answer him. The lanterns drifting across the lake reflected tiny circles of light that stretched and disappeared with every ripple, reminding me how easily even beautiful things could change shape. I looked down at the letter again, tracing the faded crease with my thumb. 10 years ago, Ethan had written words he never believed I would read. 5 years ago, he had somehow found the courage to apologize in person. Today, he was standing in front of me asking for something much harder than forgiveness. He was asking me to believe that people could become someone entirely different without pretending the past had never happened. I do not know, I admitted honestly. That is the first truthful answer either of us has given tonight. Ethan replied with a gentle smile. Before I could respond, dark clouds rolled over the mountains, covering the last streaks of sunlight. A cool breeze swept across the terrace, carrying the sharp scent of rain through the pine trees. Within seconds, the first drops began tapping softly against the wooden railings. Guests laughed as they hurried back toward the hotel, lifting jackets over their heads and calling to one another across the courtyard. Ethan instinctively reached for my hand, then paused halfway there, remembering the promise he had silently made to never assume I wanted his comfort. Instead, he pointed toward the entrance. We should head inside before it starts pouring. We had barely crossed half the courtyard when the rain came down in earnest, heavy enough to blur the lights around us into glowing streaks. I laughed despite myself as my hair was soaked almost immediately. Ethan pulled off his jacket and held it over both of us, even though it barely covered our shoulders. This is not working, I said. I know, he answered, laughing too. But it feels wrong to stop trying. We reached the lobby dripping wet and slightly out of breath. Several classmates looked up from the fireplace, smiling at our ridiculous appearance. Someone handed us fresh towels, while another joked that we looked like we had starred in a romantic movie. My cheeks warmed, but Ethan simply thanked them with the same easy kindness he seemed to offer everyone now. Later that evening, we returned to our room, where the steady rain drummed softly against the windows. Ethan disappeared into the bathroom to grab extra towels, giving me a few quiet minutes alone. I unfolded the letter once more and read every line from beginning to end. There was no dramatic declaration, no attempt to erase responsibility, no request for instant forgiveness. Only honest regret and a simple promise to become better if life ever allowed it. I folded the page carefully and slipped it back into its envelope, just as Ethan stepped out carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate from the lobby cafe. He handed one to me without speaking. We sat on opposite sides of the bed, wrapped in hotel blankets, listening to the rain fill the silence that no longer felt uncomfortable. You know, I said quietly, staring into the rising steam. The strange thing is not that I remember the worst parts of high school. Ethan looked at me with calm, patient eyes. What is the strange part? I smiled sadly. I am starting to remember the small moments when you tried to be different, and I ignored them because I believed people could never change. Ethan lowered his mug onto the nightstand, his expression unreadable except for the quiet hope shining behind his eyes. Outside, thunder rolled gently across the mountains, but inside the room something far older than the storm had finally begun to loosen its grip on both of us. Morning arrived quietly, the storm having washed the mountains clean during the night. Sunlight slipped through the curtains in long golden bands, warming the carpet and the edge of the bed where I had fallen asleep with the letter still resting on the nightstand beside me. For the first time in years, waking beside Ethan did not fill me with confusion. It filled me with questions I no longer wanted to avoid. He was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee balanced between both hands, watching the mist drift over the lake below. He turned as soon as he heard me move. "Good morning," he said with the same careful smile that had become so familiar over the years. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked. He laughed softly. "Not much." "Because of the storm?" He shook his head. "Because I kept wondering whether reading that letter changed anything." I wrapped the hotel blanket around my shoulders and joined him by the window. For several moments, we simply watched the sunrise paint the pine trees in shades of gold and green. The silence no longer felt fragile. It felt earned. It changed something, I finally admitted. Ethan looked at me, but did not interrupt. "Not because it erased the past," I continued. "It reminded me that even back then, you already knew you were wrong. I just never knew you had been carrying that truth alone." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the coffee in his hands. "Some people think guilt fades with time," he said quietly. Mine only became clearer. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a message from Melissa asking if we wanted to join a small hiking group before the reunion brunch. The trail circled the lake and ended at an old wooden overlook where graduating classes traditionally took their final photographs. I glanced at Ethan. "Want to go?" His smile returned, warmer this time. "Only if you do." The trail wound gently through towering pines, their branches still sparkling with raindrops left behind by the storm. Our group chatted about careers, families, and cities they now called home. Every conversation seemed to remind me how much people could change over 10 years. Somewhere along the path, the others drifted ahead, distracted by wildflowers and scenic viewpoints until Ethan and I found ourselves walking alone. "Do you remember this trail?" I asked. He nodded. "Senior year field trip." I smiled faintly. "You walked almost the entire way behind me." Ethan looked surprised. "You noticed?" I noticed everything back then. I just interpreted it through the worst possible lens. He let out a quiet breath. "I wanted to apologize that day too." "Why did you not?" "Because every time I got close, I convinced myself you deserved peace more than another awkward conversation with me." We reached the overlook just as the rest of the group gathered for a photograph. The reunion organizer laughed while arranging everyone into rows, insisting that couples stand together. Without thinking, Ethan stepped beside me, but left enough space between us that our shoulders did not touch. I looked at the gap separating us and realized it perfectly reflected the distance we had spent years trying to cross. Before the camera flashed, I quietly closed that space myself. Our sleeves brushed lightly together. Ethan glanced sideways, surprise softening into something gentler than happiness. It looked like relief. The photographer counted to 3, and for the first time in every picture we had ever taken together, neither of us forced a smile. We simply stood there, looking toward the future instead of trying to outrun the past. The reunion brunch ended with hugs, photographs, and countless promises to stay in touch that everyone secretly knew would fade once ordinary life returned. As people loaded suitcases into their cars and exchanged one last wave across the parking lot, I found myself lingering beside the hotel entrance without any real reason to leave. Ethan rolled both of our bags toward the sidewalk before stopping beside me. "Your train does not leave for another 2 hours," he said. "We could drive around the lake before heading to the station." I looked toward the water sparkling beneath the clear afternoon sky. 24 hours earlier, I would have searched for any excuse to avoid another minute alone with him. Now I realized I was searching for reasons to make the weekend last a little longer. "All right," I answered. "One more drive." The road curved through the mountains in wide, gentle turns, passing cabins, old fishing docks, and overlooks where tourists stopped to photograph the view. Ethan drove with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, while quiet acoustic music filled the truck. Neither of us felt pressured to keep the silence alive with conversation anymore. It had become something comfortable instead of something empty. Eventually, he pulled into a small roadside diner overlooking the lake, a place with weathered wooden booths and homemade pie displayed behind polished glass. We ordered coffee and shared a slice of blueberry pie without discussing it first, laughing when the waitress brought only one fork because she assumed we had requested it that way. She made the decision for us, I joked. Ethan smiled. Some decisions are easier than others. I looked out the window, watching an elderly couple walk slowly along the boardwalk with linked arms. They did not seem to be in any hurry. They simply matched each other's pace without thinking about it. I have been afraid of one decision for a long time, I admitted. Ethan waited quietly. I kept believing that forgiving you meant pretending none of it happened. He shook his head immediately. No, forgiveness only means refusing to let the worst chapter become the whole story. I turned back toward him. Then here is my decision. My heart pounded harder than I expected, even though the words had already formed somewhere inside me during the hike that morning. I cannot promise to forget high school. Ethan nodded. I would never ask you to. But I also do not want every happy memory we make now to spend its life apologizing for an unhappy one. His expression softened with quiet understanding. So what are you saying? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. I am saying that I choose the man sitting across from me, not because the boy he used to be disappeared, but because he worked every day to become someone different. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath before looking back at me. Thank you, he whispered. I will spend the rest of my life making sure that choice never becomes your biggest regret. When we stepped outside, a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh pine across the lake. Ethan reached toward me, then paused with the same familiar respect that had become second nature. This time I closed the distance myself and slipped my hand into his. His fingers tightened just enough to let me know he understood exactly what that simple gesture meant. As we walked back toward the truck together, I realized we were no longer trying to rewrite the past. We were finally giving ourselves permission to write everything that came after it. 6 months later, the reunion already felt like another lifetime. Not because I had forgotten it, but because it had quietly become the place where my future finally outweighed my past. Autumn had arrived, painting the streets outside our apartment in shades of amber and crimson. Ethan stood in the kitchen attempting to make blueberry pancakes for Saturday breakfast, humming softly to himself while pretending not to notice that the first one had come out looking more like the outline of Texas than an actual pancake. I leaned against the doorway, coffee mug warming my hands, and laughed. You know, I said, you still have not figured those out. He flipped the next one with exaggerated confidence. Improvement takes time. That sounds familiar. He looked over his shoulder with a grin that reached his eyes. I was hoping you would notice. The apartment felt different from the first time I had moved in years ago. Back then, every shared shelf and every quiet evening carried the invisible question of whether we were strong enough to survive the weight of old memories. Now the rooms held new traditions instead. Sunday grocery trips. Movie nights where neither of us actually watched the film because we spent more time talking than paying attention to the screen. Handwritten notes left beside the coffee maker before early meetings. Little moments so ordinary that they became extraordinary simply because they were ours. Later that afternoon, we walked through a neighborhood street fair where local artists displayed paintings, musicians performed on small stages, and children chased bubbles drifting through the cool air. We stopped at a photography booth advertising vintage-style portraits. The photographer smiled brightly. Couple special today, she announced. One printed photo and one digital copy. Ethan glanced toward me. Only if you want to. I smiled, amused that after everything we had survived, he still asked permission for the smallest things. I definitely want to. We stood together in front of the old wooden backdrop. Closer, the photographer encouraged cheerfully. You two look like you actually like each other. Ethan laughed, and I stepped closer until our shoulders touched naturally. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just comfort. The camera flashed once. Then again. The photographer handed us the finished print a few minutes later. I stared at it longer than I expected. There was no trace of the frightened teenager I used to be or the guilty boy Ethan had once been. There were simply two men smiling at each other with the quiet confidence that comes from choosing one another every single day. On the walk home, I slipped the photograph into my wallet beside the old folded letter that had started changing everything. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. He understood why both belonged there. One reminded me where we had been. The other reminded me where we were going. That evening, after dinner, rain began tapping gently against the apartment windows, sounding strangely similar to the storm outside the hotel months before. We climbed into bed with books in our hands, only to set them aside after reading the same page 3 times without paying attention. Ethan switched off the bedside lamp and smiled into the darkness. "Funny," he murmured. "The first night we had to share a bed again felt impossible." I reached for his hand beneath the blanket, lacing my fingers through his with complete certainty. "Maybe that was the difference," I whispered. "Back then we shared it because circumstances gave us no choice. Tonight we share it because every morning we keep choosing each other." Outside, the rain continued its quiet song across the city, but inside our little apartment there was only peace, proving that even the most painful memories could become the foundation of something gentle when two people were willing to grow beyond them together.